Okay, now there's a quick summary of what I want to talk about today. I'm going to try not to read my paper because I want to talk with you guys, and I also can either see you or see the paper, but not both at once. So I'm going to try and talk with you. Basically, like the series itself, I want to do a quick intro on the history of the popular song film in Japan, or musical performance in film in Japan. A quick outro on the way that some modernist filmmakers have appropriated the thing that I'm really going to talk about today, which is the popular song film and what's called the media mix, or the relation between film and other media and the lives of fans in the audience. And that's going to be the real meat, is thinking about the films that we're showing as something that's part of Japanese popular culture in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so let's start off thinking about the history of popular song and film. It actually precedes sound film in Japan. Benchi, or invited singers, would sing popular songs, especially after the introduction of electronic recording in 1927 in Japan, which led to this boom of records that would then be advertised along with films. And one of the great examples is Kenji Mizoguchi's Tokyo March from 1929. Which was advertised in cafes, on the radio, and of course in the cinema, and was produced a huge hit. The other thing I want to emphasize is the commerciality of the commercial nature of this kind of cinema. Those films that I mentioned, the kouta eiga, the silent Japanese films with accompanying records, were often played in the cinemas aimed at Western films. The reason for that is they had a sound system that could play the record along with the film. Cinemas that specialized in Japanese films were slower to incorporate sound systems, and the major Japanese studios were slow to produce synchronized sound films. What happened then was that another studio, the PCL studio, became the first major producer of Japanese sound films. Now, we probably know from the history of Japanese film, which is the first sound film in Japan. Some people say it's Mizoguchi's hometown, Furusato, which is actually shot on a Minato-ki system, or partly shot in a Minato-ki system, and it features an opera singer, Fujiwara Yoshie, as the star, and so in a sense it's a musical. Shochiku had a film called The Neighbor's Wife and Mine, which featured the Miyata Harmonica Band, both on film and as the off-screen soundtrack to that film. So both of those so-called first sound films in Japan were actually, in a sense, musicals. But the first studio to really produce something that's recognizably musical, that kind of combines the aesthetics of the Hollywood musical with the local genre of the Asakusa Revue, was the PCL studio. And their films were often actually sponsored by companies. Their first film was sponsored by a beer company. And this film, which is their second film, Capital of Pure Love, it played in a double bill with Moonlight and Pretzels, an American film shot at the Astoria studio, just here, was sponsored by the Meiji Chocolate Company. And one thing I'll point out throughout this history is the importance of Meiji chocolate to the Japanese musical film. Okay, now we are showing this film, Singing Lovebirds. I think it's the greatest example of the operetta in Japan. You probably know from the histories of musical that there's two major types of musical: the operetta style, where all the dialogue is sung, and then the Hollywood style musical, which has some relation to, there's some distinction between the diegetic world of the film and that elevated world of the musical number. And in some ways, I think this film, Tokyo Rhapsody, is the best example of a Hollywood-style backstage musical in Japan. It features Ichiro Fujiyama, who was a famous singer in a kind of semi-autobiographical film about a kid from the back streets who hits the big time but forgets his friends, realizes that was a bad decision, goes back, and then, like all musicals, there's a magical resolution where he manages to keep both fame and friendship, because his friends say, no, go be a star for our sake. And here he goes back to his manager, who's kind of told him, you're just a pawn in a publicity system, and said, yes, I'll do it for the right reasons. And what we see here is the sound dissolve, which I'd argue is characteristic of the Hollywood-style musical, where music from nowhere is introduced and the world is elevated to a different place. So here he's in a hotel room at night telling his managers he's going to become a star.
僕の気まぐれがかえって君たちを不幸にしたんじゃないかと心配していたんですが。
いや、僕は今まで嫌がらしに周囲から歌わされていました。けれど今度は僕の方から町に歌いかけてやります。
もしもし、もしもし、猪俣さん。あ、猪俣さん、私晴美。安心してよ。若朝また歌うことになったわよ。ええ、例の東京ラブソディね、早速明日お引っ込みしたいわ。ええ、東京ラブソディ。
花散るよいも銀座の柳の下でもうは君一人君一人会えばゆくひるむあの日都恋の都夢のパラダイスよ
Okay, and I love these tunes, and I think, yeah, and I'm not singing. I wish I could, but I love these tunes, and I think one reason I want to show these is to show you that some people assume that the Japanese musical must be a consequence of the occupation. It must be something about the American post-war influence on Japan. I'd argue that influence extends far earlier than people think, really back to the 19th century, and that we can see this as a kind of natural outgrowth, for example, of in the 19th century, the Japanese government spending 50% of its budget on foreign advisors, many of whom were American. So there's a strong connection to America that goes way back to the 19th century, and I think the musical and in general Japanese popular culture is part of that connection and not just the occupation. Okay, so I've mentioned the war, so I'm going to talk some more about it. I wish I had time to show you how the musical affects the war, because people would assume there's a kind of history of the Japanese government suppressing Western music during wartime. Actually, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And if you look at Japanese war films, you can see how they both become a means of supporting the war effort at the same time that their utopian sensibility is kind of critical of the straitened times of wartime Japan. So they're very interesting, ambiguous texts. But fortunately, I don't have time to that because I want to talk about the popular song film, or kayo eiga, described by one critic as pop stars appear and sing with reckless abandon in the gaps between the acting. And I like that because I think it points out the radical differentiation between the singing and the acting in these films, that from the perspective of a well-made film, might not be a good idea, but from either a modernist perspective or from a kind of popular cultural perspective, you can see how it actually functioned. Probably know many of these pop stars, but the films were characterized by this kind of rotating cycle of different stars in different permutations. The film we're showing tonight, or this afternoon, So Young, So Bright, is the first time that these three big female stars, Hibari Misora, Chiemi Eri, and Izumi Yukimura, appeared together. But by that time, Hibari, for example, had already appeared in 50 films, even though she was only 18 years old. So you can see there's this kind of, it's a high-volume, low-budget production system. There's several types. The two types I'm going to talk about today are the Toho salaryman comedies, and the Nikkatsu musicals. And those are the two forms. So I guess Toho salaryman comedies and the three-girl films that I'm going to start with. And I'd like to argue that actually the popular song film is perhaps the most characteristic cinema of high economic growth. This is the period of high economic growth in Japan. And in some ways, the popular song films are the kind of soundtrack to that optimistic period of engagement with the world and a kind of interest in cordiu, so exchange that in some ways maybe has faded a little in Japan. And so I see these films in some ways as nostalgic for a good time in the relations between Japan and the rest of the world. Okay. All right, so one of the things I really have to emphasize is that the popular song film doesn't stand alone. Nobody ever saw a popular song film without knowing anything about it. And the reason for that is that these films were part of a media mix. In other words, they're part of a multimedia strategy of promoting popular stars, popular singing stars, in the medium of film through another medium, which is the medium of song and movie entertainment magazines. And the most important of these is Heibon. And as you can see, this is sorry, stay close to the microphone. The graph on the left shows that it's one of the top 2 most popular, most widely circulated magazines in Japan in the 1950s. And the one at the bottom shows that after the mid-1950s, it sold over 1 million copies each month. And later in the 50s, there was a weekly Heibon as well. So in a sense, it became the medium for linking fans with these stars in different media, both television and film, and actually also radio. Heibon had their own Heibon hour on the radio and then television. So it's an entire kind of culture of popular song that the films are part of. And we can't really think of these films outside of that relation. Okay. It's hard to know who went to the cinema and what they thought, but there are some people in the 1950s investigating audiences. And one thing you find is that musical films are the most popular type of film among young audiences, especially female audiences. And I think that has a lot to do with the popularity of these films. And these are the 3 girls, Yukimura Izumi, Masaru Hibari, Eri Chiemi. The 3 girls was a concept that became a format and that was then replicated with a whole series of other young female singing stars on film and then also on television. The film we're showing today, So Young, So Bright, stars these 3 people who are conveniently color-coded, not just in this publicity photograph, but actually throughout the entire film that you'll watch later. So it helps to tell them apart. The films themselves aren't just part of a culture of celebrity, they are reflective of the culture of celebrity. They feature different ways of acknowledging celebrity culture. They're always posing or creating photographic albums or imagining that they're producing films or visiting film sets. And on the top right is actually the director of this film, directing another film within the film. Those kinds of nested loops are characteristic of the reflexive nature of the popular song film and the jokey way that it acknowledges the direct relation to the audience. The other thing I want to point out is product placement. This at the bottom is the magazine Heibon that I just showed you. They're actually making an identikit of a man they're looking for, a boy they're looking for, from Heibon. The film itself is actually the film to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Heibon magazine. And it was actually first serialized in Heibon magazine and then agreed with Toho to produce it as a film. The other thing, again, is the ubiquitous Meiji chocolate, which is also, it seems like these very slim, attractive actresses eat nothing but Meiji chocolate throughout the film. Okay. And so here they are with their Meiji chocolate. And I really like this line because it points out something of the attitude of fans toward stars and perhaps even of Japan toward the United States. That we think of fandom as in some ways a very even obsequious or a humble relation to a star, but actually there's a kind of aggression hidden in the fan-star relation. When they go to see actually themselves performing on the stage, so they play both stars and characters in this film, they don't say, I identify with the star, or I imagine I become a star. They say, it's no good just watching. You have to be active. If I really like a performer, it's as if they become me. In other words, they're converting them into me. It's a much more aggressive, pulling relationship rather than a kind of worshipful relationship. And I think the ambiguity between pushing and pulling is one of the things that we can think about, both in terms of fans in relation to these films and their stars, but also in terms of Japan in relation to the United States in this period. All right. And so I mentioned that if we think of the aesthetics of this film, we have to think of actually the magazines that advertise them, and in some ways the look of the film, which is only Toho's fourth color film, is the look of these aren't color, but they do have color photographs at the beginning of Heibon. And there's a very direct similarity in terms of composition and color between the magazine and the films, I'd argue. And on the right is the novel that they produced, again, color-coded. But it's not just the story. The relation between stars and fans includes creating material objects that bring the stars close. For example, you can buy mame shashin, or bean photographs, that will fit in your wallet and that you can hold close to your body of your favorite star. I have one actually, I took it out, but they would give free bookmarks every month with stars like Alan Ladd and Nakamura Meiko or somebody, but also the Kotaishi, the Emperor-elect, what are they called? The Crown Prince, thank you. Yeah. The Crown Prince was a celebrity too, and you could buy the Crown Prince's bean photograph and put it in your wallet if you wanted to. They also had hand towels, and so this is the star, this is Izumi Yukimura, and you can buy a hand towel with an image of your favorite star, and how much closer to the body can you bring the star than a hand towel? And so these are all things that the fan club of Heibon organizes in order to create this media mix circuit between fans and stars. And of course, the reflexivity only gets more intense as you go through. This is one of the 5 films that Misora Hibari appeared in December of 1955, just a few months after So Young, So Bright. Her brother comes home singing the theme song. She says, yeah, I want to go see that movie. She actually plays 2 roles. On the right, she is herself as Misora Hibari. On the left, she's Misora Bibari. Or actually, just Bibari. She's a girl who looks exactly like Misora Hibari, who is an apprentice bus conductor, but she has a mark, nigori, on her nose that looks like the dakuten voicing mark in Japanese. So they call her Bibari instead of Hibari. Through another miraculous coincidence, they meet. Oh, the other difference between them is she can't sing. And the reason she can't sing is her mother is tone deaf. But she can imitate her mother exactly, which means Hibari says, you must be able to sing, really. So she teaches her to sing, and at the end of the film, they have a duet of both of them singing Hibari's latest song. So you can see how it ties all these things into reflexive loops. And that just goes on. In the film, she actually goes by Misora Hibari playing at the Nichigeki Theatre, the big Toho theatre. And then in the next film, in the 3 Girls series, they go to the Toho musical. Again, it's the 3 girl stars playing 3 ordinary characters. This time, they go consciously to see themselves, Chiemi, Hibari, and Izumi. And this is what they say. And I don't have subtitles, but basically, they go to the show and they've been invited by the captain of the tennis club, and they debate, does he like us or not?
遅いな、久保田さん。
Because
女
he's
性を
late,
待たせるなんて失礼ね。でも切符もらってんだから。
but he bought us
そっか
tickets.
ねえ、あの人女の子大嫌いだなんて嘘ね、きっと。え
So maybe it
な
said
ん
he
で
doesn't like girls,
だ
but
っ
maybe he
て
does.
本当に嫌いだったら私たちに切符なんてくれないわよ。
Because if he didn't like girls,
で
he
も
wouldn't buy
あ
us
まり好
tickets.
きでもないんじゃない？どうして？だってもし誰か一人を好きだったらその人だけを誘うはずでしょ？そうか。あら、久保田さんってそんな人じゃないわ。え？
So
そんな人じゃないっ
it doesn't
て。
matter, but basically, because he bought tickets for 3 of us, maybe that means he doesn't really like us. If you really like a girl, he'd buy one. But the point is, this guy who's been walking backwards and forward across the camera throughout that scene,
行こう。
pointing out the absurdity of stars playing ordinary characters going to see themselves perform on the stage.
君たちひばりちゃんと泉ちゃんに似てっからジュルジュルジュルジュル見られるんだぞ。
It goes further
そう
because
いう
it
あん
turns
た
out
ちみ
that
ちゃ
they're
んと
all
っくりよ。
fans
嫌い嫌いあんな
of
の。
the
私
stars,
断然ひばり。
but they're actually
私
fans
は
of
ちえみちゃ
different
んだな。
stars.
断
So
然ちえ
each
みちゃ
one
んだ。
likes a different
あ
star and
あんた
doesn't
雪村
recognize
泉
their
でし
own
ょ。そう
similarity
よ。
to the star.
あら、来たわ。
finally
いや
becomes,
どうも遅くなっちゃってごめんごめん。
and
はい、これは
as
罰金。
compensation, he
どうも
gives
あり
them
がとう。
Meiji chocolate. And then here's the ambiguity where the fan denies the relation to the star, but I think we can see that actually
あんな痩せっぽちの
she
カチョンボみたい
recognizes
な
and enjoys
気
her
にないもん
relation too. So she says she's dangling, but then she looks at her anyway. So it's a really interesting playing with the whole relation of fan and star. And I think we can't see these films as narratives, but instead as ways of allowing fans to act out this relationship to the film. And one thing I'd say is that I think film studies has been informed by a concept of classical narrative that makes us think that storytelling is the center of cinema, and that things that go beyond storytelling or that distract from storytelling are a kind of excess. But if we think of the history of popular cinema, that excess is actually essential to popular cinema. That popular cinema is characterized by what Richard Maltby calls a commercial aesthetic, in which storytelling and coherence is always sacrificed to a kind of joke or emotional relationship that you can directly create between the star and the film. So I think these films are in that sense characteristic of popular cinema. Okay, so I talked about the Toho three-girl musicals. The other film we're showing today is the Ishihara Yujiro film, The Stormy Man. Now, as probably well known, Yujiro came to prominence in the juvenile delinquency film, Crazed Fruit. Well, actually, yeah, Crazed Fruit's the one where he came to prominence. It's a Sun Tribe film. It's about Japanese juvenile delinquents. It created an enormous moral panic. And so this is not the reason he became a star. He actually had to kind of retrench and resell himself through the medium of Heibon magazine in order to become famous. And these are the kind of images that he then appeared in over the next couple of years. So on the one hand, he established this persona as a kind of carnal expert, you know, this kind of unclothed, sexual, tough guy. On the other hand, he performs this kind of role in the magazine in order to broaden his popularity. And I think we can actually argue that his stardom, just like the other stars, he's a singing star before he was a film star, that it's actually his songs that were more successful than his films in 1957. One of those songs is Ore wa matteru ze, you know, I Am Waiting, which was very successful in February of 1957, and then the title was taken to make a film in October of 1957. And this, as you can see, preparatory to the release of the film, Heibon published a kayo manga, you know, a popular song comic, and it's a rewriting of the lyric to I Am Waiting as Yujiro waiting for you, presumably the female reader, to find your way to his address. And I'd argue actually that Heibon it's about enlisting the postal system in the circuit of celebrity. So Heibon, all the goods always list the price of postage. The postal system is how you circulate things. They have letters and envelopes for different films that you can use to write to your friends about your excitement over fans. The star interviews always feature the star's address, so you can write, you know, I'm sure they don't really answer their own letters, but presumably you can presume that you are writing directly to the star. And then these kinds of comics sort of encode that relationship, that you can actually find your way close to the star. And that's the kind of relationship that the culture of Heibon and the popular song film tries to set up. And so when we see Yujiro in The Stormy Man, that film is really, again, a kind of reflexive film about the creation of this kind of star. On the one side, a troubled, tough guy with mother issues. On the other side, a friendly older brother who can be the kind of target of romantic imaginings. And music is absolutely central to Yujiro's success. You can see he actually released or re-released almost 30 singles in 1958, so an enormous number of records. And the records are things like this, quite different from his Sun Tribe persona as a tough guy or koha. This is the Nampa Yujiro, the lover boy persona. This record, the second one he released, You-chan and Your Room, it's actually recorded as if he is rushing back from the studio to come to your room and say, sorry, I'm late. I was so busy at the studio. Let me play you some records. Let me sing to you. And then he talks and sings throughout the record as if it's a virtual experience. So both the records and the films are less about creating narratives of some other world than they are about creating direct fantasy scenarios of a direct relation between fans and stars. And of course, that's what happened when he appeared in The Stormy Guy. When I was doing my research in Japan, I would the kaiki, the anniversary of Yujiro's death, there would be an event at a cafe in Kamakura that was dedicated to Showa 1930s nostalgia. So it was 5,000 yen for all you can drink. And I would talk with all the people about their memories of Yujiro. And they said that when this film came out, they were standing like here in relation to the screen. Like the whole cinema was packed with people. And whenever he appeared on the screen, everybody just screamed. And so it's that relation, direct relation to the star, and then a social relation among the fans that is the kind of purpose of these films, rather than telling a story. Okay. And then finally, of course, the songs themselves are then materialized in books that are then circulated amongst fans. And, of course, that's what produces popularity. The Heibon, again, reflexively has popularity contests. Yujiro starts winning them in 1958, which is why he is invited to represent Japan in the historical meeting with Elvis Presley when Elvis first comes to Japan. And everyone pointed out, Yujiro's taller than Elvis, and they were really happy about that. Okay, but these are the kind of films that he was appearing in once he became that kind of super film song star. This is Red Pier from later in 1958. And in this scene, he plays a tough guy gangster who watches a drug dealer get killed, and then his friend is assassinated by this guy in the previous scene. And I should have shown the last few seconds of the previous scene, because his friend just get killed. And then we get, instead of a sound dissolve that we see in Tokyo Rhapsody, this is a sound cut. The film just breaks and becomes something else in this scene.
俺は思う海の彼方空は青空だ心が弾むぜ鳩場に咲いた恋は楽しいものだぜ白い雲いつも流れるのさ海の色は青えらいご機嫌やな潮のカニよ
Well, I think we've seen enough of that, but where is this? This is actually the record of Akai Hatoba, the song that gave the film its name. And it's not a recording in the space of the film. The sound signature is clearly that high reverb sound studio sound that records had at the time. So even though the film shows people listening to Yujiro, what they and the audience is listening to is actually the record that the film is named after. And it's kind of strange that the film, well, not strange, but that's characteristic of the film, to be completely uninterested in establishing a world and instead just giving you a chance for this direct relationship to the song and to the star that you can also have if you listen to the record. So this is kind of characteristic of the popular song film. Okay, so this is the cinema of high economic growth. This is the period of high economic growth, and we can see Japanese per capita GDP catches up with Europe, if not United States, over this period. But one consequence of that, of course, is that cinema collapses because leisure, suburbanization, people move away from the cinemas, and especially television. And I think we can see this period as the shift in the center of gravity of Japanese popular culture from cinema to television. And that also affects the popular song films, which in the early 1960s start to feature television stars rather than singing stars. Than film stars. It's a very contradictory period. This is both these photographs are taken in 1958. We can see this kind of shift from kind of third world Japan to Olympic Japan. It's the period of rockabilly and the Western Carnival, but also of the fantasies of the bright life, you know, the kind of household electrification in the late 50s and early 60s. But it's also the period of Ampo, you know, of the struggles over the American-Japan Security Treaty and the heightened consciousness of the unequal relation between the United States and Japan, which is encoded in that treaty. And that's one reason I would argue why the popular song film changes between the 50s and the 60s. It goes from this optimistic, purely fan-related, kind of service-related medium to one that actually starts to encode some hesitation or reservation or cynicism about the relationship between Japan and America. And I think we can see that. Who saw the film last night? A few people, okay, that's good. So I think we can see that in this scene from You Too Can Succeed, You Can Succeed Too, where the salaryman, after protesting their life as kind of economic animals in the high economic growth period, then kind of die on the street, which kind of reminds us of the street battles in Ampo, or maybe even further back, World War II, which is a constant reference in this film. So something darker and more cynical starts to appear in the popular song film after 1960. Now, having said that, there are also films like Young Season, or this is Wakai Kisetsu. This is very strange. It's a TV show on NHK produced by the Watanabe agency that also provides talent to the Toho Film Company, produced as a film by Toho in the genre of the industrial competition film, which is also what You Can Succeed Too is in. So this is two companies, they're cosmetics companies, and they're competing over absurd products like stinky lipstick that will announce your presence in the room, or in this case, drinkable white foundation. And just reflect on the cynicism of that concept.
伝統を誇るトレビアン化粧品が3年3ヶ月と3週間にわたって苦心研究の結果見事完成いたしましたのの申しろいホワイトロマン皆様のプランタンが7年7ヶ月と7週間にわたる研究の結果完成いたしましたの申しろいドリンクローズ突如発売かの有名なアメリカのジャクリーヌ化粧品会社と技術提携のもとに生まれましたこのホワイトロマン
貿易自由化の波に乗って本場フランスは花の都パリより原料を直輸入いたしましたドリンクローズ
お嬢様あなたの美しさを2倍にするホワイトロマン
奥様あなたの魅力を3倍にするドリンクローズ
あなたの恋人がささやくでしょうおう君は僕の太陽だお膝付きだサーチライトだ
あなたのご主人がささやくでしょう I want you, I need you, I love you と
あなたのマスコットにホワイトロマンをハンドバッグにぜひどうぞ
あなたの夢をピンクに彩るドリンクローズをベッドのお供にぜひどうぞこのお白いの最大最高の特徴と申しますのは飲めばたちまち皮膚の下からお肌がバラ色に輝く話題の化粧品で
こんにちは
Jerry Fujio. So if we make the mistake of taking that seriously, we might start talking about Americanization and a kind of, you know, akogare no America or something, like people worshipping America. But I think this is much more ironic than that. It's trying to find a concrete representation of the invisible but real gap or inequality between Japan and America, power inequality between Japan and America through these absurd figures. And I think we see that later in the film when they actually make the case that sometimes the fake is better made than the original. There is a kind of consciousness that, yes, there's a geopolitical incline, there's a slope between the United States and Japan, but in some ways the more authentic position is to be a resistant figure at the bottom end of that slope rather than a privileged figure sitting happily at the top of that slope. And I think we can see that also at the end of You Can Succeed Too. And unfortunately, I don't have a still from the end, but people saw it, right? And it's a very strange ending to the film. I mean, the narrative ending is archetypal. Basically, the musical magically resolves impossible tensions, in this case between a desire for community and harmony versus ambition and modernity and so on. And the film manages to combine them all, so even though it shows that the hierarchy within the company is unjust, the good guy gets to marry the boss's daughter, which, as we know, is the first way to get ahead in the world. So it resolves all of those narrative tensions. But then something strange happens. It's supposed to resolve on the golf course, but suddenly it becomes a cyclorama, an artificial set in which all of the numbers are reprised and all of the different settings are reprised. And in a way, it kind of objectifies and ironizes the absurdity of that ending. Now, of that resolution. Now, I would argue there's a material underpinning to that ending. And that's that the director actually just wanted to shoot it on the golf course. The golf course, which is actually the American firing range near Mount Fuji. And so Toho got permission to go there and shoot these scenes that would just magically resolve all the tensions in the musical in the normal way. But some GIs in a Jeep turned up and kicked them out. And even though they had letters of permission to be there and shoot their film, these guys just kicked them out and there's nothing they could do about it. So they had to go home and shoot it on the Toho studio with no set because they hadn't intended to do this. And yet, actually, I think that more effectively represents the unequal power relation between Japan and the United States, which has been the theme of the film throughout. The film is not a film about Americanization. It's a film about the impossibility of Americanization given the straitened conditions of the constrained conditions of Japanese life in that period. So it actually heightens the audience's consciousness of that unequal power relation. Okay. Right, so I want to finish up with what I want to argue is that consciousness runs throughout the popular songs of the 1960s. So I'm going to just skip over Ueki Toshi, but I think there's something really interesting about the characteristic pose of Ueki. And you can see, the twist itself becomes a thing in 1962, and everybody starts to distort their movements in ways that parodically represent this global craze for the twist. But I want to argue that, as I mentioned in the introduction yesterday, modernists like Abe Kobo started to think about the musical not just as a cheesy commercial form, but as a kind of anti-naturalist form that has resources for objectifying everyday life and making us think critically about it. Oshima Nagisa, of course, a well-known modernist in the 1960s, famous for the films he made and then showed at ATG, the Art Theatre Guild. But actually, he never wanted to show his films at ATG. He always tried to show his films in the studio cinemas. And it's only when they refused him that he turned to ATG. So, for example, he made this film. Oh, and when he was a contract director at Shochiku, he was forced to include popular song stars like Isao Sasaki, the so-called Japanese Elvis, who's actually the star of The Sun's Burial, if you ever see that film. But once he was making independent films and then selling them to Toho, he always relied on celebrity, and usually musical celebrity. So in this film, Three Resurrected Drunkards, which is obviously about the Vietnam War and the famous news photographs from the Vietnam War, he includes the Folk Crusaders, the biggest selling band of that year. And then showed this film in Shochiku cinemas. He did the same thing with the film we're showing in this series, Treatise and Japanese Bawdy Song. And actually, when you see that film, I really want you to ask yourselves, how on earth did he show this in a regular commercial cinema? But the thing I want to point out is that Oshima is not radically breaking the form of the popular song film when he does this. It is a modernist film that incorporates all of this ironic critique of politics in the 1960s, but actually this film played as a double bill with another Shochiku film. And that film was a group sounds film. In other words, it was a film, a vehicle for a band that was created in imitation of the Beatles after they visited Japan in 1966, and the films are created in imitation of Beatles films like Help. And who's seen Help? Okay, good. So everyone knows this. So the band ends up going to Iwo Jima, kind of like they go to, somewhere in the Caribbean in Help, right? I can't remember. They go to Iwo Jima and they meet an unreturned soldier who is still fighting the Second World War. And they tell him that they have a problem with these other guys in Iwo Jima. And this is the scene where they tell him. And I want you to think about how even this popular film, not Oshima's film, but the group Sounds film, has a way of thinking about post-war Japanese history. And this is how I'm going to end. So this is the final comment. It's going to come from a film called Onward Jaguars. Jaguars is the band, Landing Under Enemy Fire.
しかし日本人のくせにそんな売国奴がいるとは実にけしからん。よし、米軍でなくても構わん。明朝を期して総攻撃を決行する。ところで大東亜戦争の状況はどうなっとるか。
大東亜戦争なんですかそれ。ベトナム戦争ならまだ続いてますけど。
ベトナム戦争、どうも言うことが消せんな。
南ベトナムの内乱ですよ。ベトコン知らないんですか。アメリカが乗り出しているからなかなか終わりそうにないんですよ。
日本はいいわね、戦争がないからね。
何だって憲法で戦争放棄を歌ってあるじゃないですか。戦争放棄。なんてこと言うんだ貴様。困ったな、この人何も知らないんだよ。わしが一体何を知らんって言うんだ。
日本は23年前にもう戦争に負けちゃったんですよ。
そうですよ。何負けた。それは本当か貴様。そんなことですよおじさん。ピカドンで終わりですよ。それで祖国日本は一体どうなっとる。
そうですね、まあ平和っつうんでしょうかね。
昭和元禄時代なんつってね、僕よくわかんないけど。
分かっておりますよ。私は戦争が終わった時は3つでした。
僕まだ生まれてなかった。
戦後23年ですからね、いろんなことがありました。
もくもくキノコ雲、慌てた日本帝国は幸福無条件、夢に終わった大聖戦、飛ぶ鳥落とす勢いの東条英機の公主権、街にあふれるアメリカ兵、I love you, I love you、隣で起こる銃声はこれぞ朝鮮大事変、それゆえやれぶれ軍需品、おかげで人務大警備、花屋の娘の美智子さん、もらって嬉しい皇太子、野球にプロレスだっこちゃん、一億総白人、反抗競争盛り上がり、出っ歯の節が引っ込んだ、これを開いた大事業、東京ドオリンピック、ベトナム戦争始まって、ここと思えばまたあちら、ツバメのようなベトコンに、鳥のアメリカたりたり、いくら反対全楽園、少女呼ばわりされるほど、マイホームとマイカーで、太平昭和元禄。
そしてこれが現代の日本でとても人気のあるジャガーズ。私はそこのバンドボーイと、まあざっとこんなわけですよ。
東の方向はどちらですか。
あ、東はね、あっち。
かなりオーバーな人だね。
でもかっこいいわね、ヒッピーでミリタリールックだし。
Okay, so sardonic, ironic, I'm not sure how to describe that scene, but that's my last word on the popular song film. So I'd invite you if you have any questions or comments. There's many things I left out, so I'm happy to discuss them with you. Yeah, so the anamorphic or CinemaScope style lenses were introduced into Japan in 1957. The way in which they were introduced in Japan was actually not a direct technology transfer from the United States to Japan, but instead the invention of lenses to fit in between the existing lens and the camera to create an anamorphic squeeze so that you could then release CinemaScope style prints. But because they didn't use the actual CinemaScope lenses, they could call it Toho scope or Toei scope or Shochiku scope. So every studio had their own widescreen system. It's not clear that there's a direct relationship between spectacle or the musical and widescreen film in general, because so many Japanese films were converted, or so many Japanese films became made in widescreen, about 96% at the peak. So there's no necessary relationship between genre and that widescreen technology. It simply signified something like visual modernity, and that's why they incorporated it. Having said that, the film we're showing today was Toho's fourth color film, and the third film in the Three Girls series is Toho's first widescreen film. So there is a relationship between the musical as a kind of advertising of the new technologies. But once those new technologies are introduced, they're used for all different genres. And there's no necessary relation between some idea of spectacle and the technology. It's much more a relationship between the concept of cinematic modernity and the technology. Sorry.
One thing I noticed about UNC 2 last night was that even though it had its criticisms of capitalism and high economic growth, it really seemed to be a celebration of capitalism. And it reminded me a lot of like Chinese and Russian propaganda musicals about communism. Mm-hmm. So can you comment on how musicals are used as like propaganda for the dominant economic paradigm of the times?
So some people said this. There was most Japanese film critics are on the left, and there are plenty of Japanese film critics who would criticize studio production. For example, Godzilla is encouraging Japanese remilitarization, those sorts of arguments. There are directly, the CIA sponsored Toei to make, what's it called? Jetki, but it's Takakura Ken in a film about jet pilots, which is very much in support of Japan as a bastion against communism in the Cold War. So there are films which very directly speak to the contemporary politics of the time. I think what's interesting about these films is what I call transcultural mimesis, that they actually have a very complex relation to the American capitalism, that at one level they are undeniably celebrating. There's a pull of kind of homage to the power of both American capitalism, American culture, American cinema. On the other hand, there's a parodic element in all of these films where capitalism is absurd or doesn't work, or Americans are privileged and foolish. If you think about the Americans shown in the film last night, they're very nice people, but they're kind of silly, and they're kind of like botchama, they're just kind of privileged people who are seen from the perspective of Japanese who have to kind of service them. So there's a kind of pull and push in relation to those people. And what I'm interested in these films is that actually that ambiguous pull and push relation can turn into a way to understand that relationship, the kind of objectification that Abe Kobo wrote about when he talked about musicals. So I don't think it's just criticism. I think it's celebration and critique at the same time. Sorry, you had a question.
Are all these movies made mainly for a domestic market, or are they exported to, say, other Asian nations?
So some were exported to other places in Asia, but otherwise the export market was basically Japanese communities in other parts of the world. So some of these films were shown. For example, the La Brea Toho from 63, I think, would show these Toho films, like the second Young Season film, or You Too Can Succeed, for example. The film today, So Young, So Bright, I have no idea where that title comes from, but it must have been shown, or they must have decided to give it that title at some point.
We look for subtitled movies all the time, so last night's film, we couldn't get a subtitle.
Right, yeah.
So they weren't going to China or Korea. That market really wasn't established at the time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure those films wouldn't have been widely shown in the West. Actually, the later film today, The Stormy Man, was shown in a. I think that was also dubbed into French, but I can't remember. The route was actually films that were not prestige productions would be sold as a block, and there was a French distributor who was interested in these films, so they would dub them into French. They would get censored, and then they would be shown in England. And so if you read the English comments, it's like, there's something absurd about Japanese people speaking French, you know. So the way in which these films can actually be seen outside of Japan is incredibly narrow. And I have to say, incredibly uncharitable. Like, when they showed The Stormy Man, the reviewer, I think it was John Gillett, the guy in England did a lot to really bring Japanese film into England. And he said something about how the Japanese have managed to learn the most meretricious aspects of Hollywood cinema or something in this film. So look out for the meretricious aspects of Hollywood cinema when you see the film tonight. I think it has more than that. But I think in general, at the time, whenever these films were shown, like, has anyone seen Masamura Yasuzo's Giants and Toys? Yeah, so that's another film which I think is not an Americanized film. It is about the impossibility of Americanization given the economic and cultural conditions of Japan. But when it played at the Venice Film Festival, the critics said, this is Coca-Cola cinema. We don't want anything to do with this. And I think it completely misses the critical aspect of those films. Yeah. So.
Well, the whole question of irony as a literary tool, or because I remember up at Columbia University when Professor Keene was there, and there was this discussion that sort of between the theater department and the Center for Japanese Culture and so on about how central irony is in Western theater. And supposedly irony was not something that was used maybe at all, you could say, from that perspective, in Japanese theater, film, so on and so forth. And yet, say the film last night, it seemed to have a tremendous amount of very subtle ironies.
Yeah, I don't know where all these ideas come from, but people have said that a lot about Japan. And sometimes I think people they need to say something, and they just make it up. You know? But concepts like fujori, fushi, yes, maybe they're not the most central, and I think it's true. But it's true of popular cinema. Well, you know, it's hard to think of many examples of films that undermine their audience that become widely popular. So there is a limit to how far you can go. But having said that, concepts like absurdity or fujori and ironic or satirical like fushi were absolutely discussed by people interested in filmmaking in the 50s and 60s. So I really don't think it's an alien concept to Japanese filmmakers at all. Yeah.
Can you say something about the roots of this genre that are very distinctly Japanese? Like, does it go back into the Benshi silent film era, and how that evolved into?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the problem with looking for the distinctly Japanese aspects is that when we find something that looks different, if we look back at the dominant tradition, we actually find that it's in there too. So we could say something like the American musical is the integrated Hollywood Broadway adaptation with the sound dissolved between the diegetic world and the elevated world of the musical number, and these films do something different. But actually, if you think about the entire history of American musical performance and film, there are many films that are just an excuse to show some performances, rock and roll musicals, there's Elvis films, for example, are they musicals? And so it becomes harder to recognize that there are radical differences. And rather, I'd say these are differences that come from the situation of the filmmakers, and it's not culture in the large sense, it's culture in the sense of economics and opportunity and time. And so, for example, one thing about these films that really strikes me is there's a kind of collapse in high and low, or a mix of high and low, where avant-garde artists end up making low culture. And I think in the United States, for example, New York intellectuals are quite widely separated from LA studios. And so there isn't that much integration between them. But in Japan, if you want to make avant-garde music, make poetry, work in painting, there are very few foundations that will support you while you make your art in this period. And so instead, you always have to do a commercial side job. So Takemitsu Toru, the famous avant-garde composer, made lots of film scores. Mayuzumi Toshiro, who went to Darmstadt every year and talked with Adorno and made some great avant-garde music, also did musicals on stage and on film. So people have to do this kind of double role, and I think that produces a different kind of consciousness in these films, which is critical, ironic, distanced in some way, in the way that Abe Kobo wrote about. Yeah.
Does enough pre-war Japanese cinema survive that we can extrapolate from the examples?
I mean, it is hard because there isn't much. The musical films, if we think about the connection between music and film, we can go all the way back to the beginning of Japanese film exhibition. I'm editing an anthology right now on the transition to sound in Japan, and one of the writers has found these great quotations from the cinemas where people would do joruri performance, so a kind of sung recitation performance to film, and they would have to do it for every screening. And so there's like somebody did it 18 times in a row and coughed up blood and collapsed. So there's kind of these ideas of these ways of tracing the sound environment or the kind of soundscape of the cinema through documentation rather than the film itself. When it comes to sound on film, that's from the mid to late 1930s, and the survival rate's not so bad for those films. So there are more of them available. I wish we could show, there's one that's just been rediscovered. I showed the image, Capital of Pure Love, which really seems to me like a Gold Diggers of 1933 film with lesbianism and rape and all kinds of really strange, hard things in it. It's kind of like the first stage of early musicals, a kind of emullient applause, harsh, tragic version of the musical in mid-1930s Japan.
It might be around time. But thank you so much for the lecture.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.